Hey friends, I'm Jason Odell and welcome to my photo tip for this month. It's June 2019 and today I'm talking all about photographic filters in the digital age. And I'm talking about filters you put on your lens. I'm not talking about doggy ear Snapchat filters, okay? So let me talk a little bit about why you might want to use a filter and whether you need them if you're a digital photographer. So filters have been around forever and they usually involve some sort of glass or resin element that you can either screw into the front of your lens or attach using a filter holder if it's a rectangular filter, and put it in the front of your lens to create some sort of effect or to correct color or to increase contrast. There's a lot of different filters out there. Some filters created special effects like little starbursts or multiple things. And filters were extremely important for film photographers. And the reason for that is that with film, you had one chance to get the image right in the camera. You didn't have a lot of latitude with post-processing film. I'm talking about shooting slide film. I'm talking about stuff if you didn't have a dark room, shooting color film. Sure, you could push the processing a little bit. If you had a dark room, you could dodge and burn, but you needed to get that exposure dead on in the camera. With digital cameras, things are a little bit different. I'm going to talk about that momentarily. So the biggest reason for using a filter in general is to correct something or improve the image in the camera at the time of capture. Now filters come in two different flavors. You can get ring mount filters that screw into the front of your lens. You can get rectangular filters or square filters that slide into a filter holder, and this filter holder attaches to the front of your lens using this little adapter ring, so you can just attach it there. With any filter, you run the risk of degrading your image because you're putting another glass, or in some cases optical resin, glass air interface between your camera lens and the light that's coming through it. So if you've got a filter that's not of good quality, if it doesn't have good optical coatings, if it's got scratches, or if it could be uneven, it could produce a color cast, you actually run the risk of degrading your image, and you certainly don't want that to happen. So with any filter, you always want to remember to use a quality filter. Now, what are the kinds of filters that we have available to us, and should we use them on our digital camera? Well, the first filter that everybody talks about is this guy right here, the UV filter. Now, the UV filter is pretty much clear, but it was intended to offset a bluish color cast with color film and cut down on a little bit of haze effects. And so some of these UV filters might have had a pinkish cast to them. Nowadays, these UV filters are sold as protective filters. And the idea is that if you put this little thin piece of glass in a ring mount on the front of your camera lens, it's going to protect it from damage. And let me just say that this has always been a controversial topic, but here's the thing. You have to ask yourself, what is your filter protecting your lens from? If the answer is I'm protecting my lens from getting salt water on it, or maybe sparks or sand or something that might damage your lens in the environment, then I think it's fair to consider using a good UV filter to protect against that. But if your answer is I'm using a protective filter to protect against impact damage to my lens, well then I got another thing for you. Because when you have a lens, now here's my 24-70 2.8, the front element on this lens is good optical glass. It's very thick and it's quite resistant to impact damage by itself. If I'm a good photographer, I'm going to use my lens hood, and this lens hood is going to protect this lens from impact damage along with my lens cap if I'm using it. In fact, if I put a cheap thin piece of glass protective filter, screw it on the ring mount here, and I drop my lens without using the lens hood, there's a pretty good chance that, sure, the filter is not only going to break, but this metal ring is going to get dinged, and you're going to have a really hard time removing that broken filter from your lens. So in the case of UV filters, I generally do not use them unless you've got some sort of environmental element that could potentially scratch or get water onto your lens surface. So those are UV filters. I don't recommend using them for the most part. What about the next kind of filter? This is right here. This is a polarizing filter, sometimes called a polarizer. Now, polarizing filters are used for two things. The thing about polarizers is that they block scattered light. They only let light of a certain orientation pass through it. So by nature, they're going to be a little bit dark. You're going to lose about a stop of light, sometimes a little more depending on the polarizer, when you put this on your lens. So if you're shooting in bright conditions, that's great. If you're shooting in dim conditions, you're going to have to either increase your ISO or slow down your shutter speed. So you got to keep that in mind. But polarizing filters are fun because you can rotate them to change the angle of the polarization of the light. And they serve two purposes. One is blocking glare from reflected light, and this is reflected from water or from leaves, foliage. Leaves have that waxy surface that sometimes looks white. The other reason people used a polarizing filter was to increase contrast in the sky. Okay, so of these two functions that a polarizer can do, there's only one in the world of digital photography that I recommend you use a polarizer for, and that's to remove glare. You cannot remove glare from water or from leaves in post-processing. You just can't do it. Contrast, however, is something you can add in post-processing if you're shooting even in JPEG. You can add contrast to a sky. You can use different adjustment tools in your post-processing software. And one reason why I caution you against using a polarizer for skies is that if you're using a wide-angle lens, the sky can sometimes look uneven or become over-polarized, even look black. And this is especially true if you're using wide lenses because in the sky, the maximum effect of a polarizer is when you're pointed 90 degrees away from the direction of the sun. So if I've got the sun over here and I'm pointed 90 degrees away, I'm going to have maximum darkening. As I increase my angle of view with a wide-angle lens, that effect tapers off, and you're going to see an uneven sky. And frankly, that's harder to get rid of in post than if you just hadn't used the polarizer in the first place. So polarizing filters, they reduce the amount of light coming in. They're a dark filter. They are great at removing glare, but when it comes to adding contrast in skies, there's a lot of post-processing options out there. And you can check on my website to see some of those options. Okay, another kind of filter, and I don't have an example of one of these today, are things called color correcting filters or color enhancing filters. There's two different kinds here. And color correcting filters were used with film to color balance your film. So if you had daylight balanced film and you were shooting under fluorescent lights, you would use a magenta filter to get rid of that greenish cast. And if you ever shot print film and got it back from the drugstore and you shot natural without a flash, you'd see this greenish cast in your images. Well, when it comes to color balance, shooting in RAW, shooting digital, pretty much makes color correcting and color enhancing filters obsolete. Why? You can use your white balance and tint sliders in your post-processing software to adjust color balance. And then second, you can adjust any color that you want, up or down, with saturation, intensity, using post-processing. So if you want to boost the reds, just boost the reds. There's no need to do this with a filter, okay? So I don't recommend using color correcting or color enhancing filters really at all if you're shooting digital. Okay, another big filter that was very popular with landscape photographers is this one right here. This is the graduated neutral density filter. And these are typically rectangular filters, so you're going to use them in this filter mount. And you can slide them up or down. You can see on this filter, hopefully you can see that there's a little horizon line here where the darkening tapers off. Now these filters we use for a very specific purpose, and that was to compress the tones in a scene. So if you had a landscape where the foreground was kind of dark and the sky was fairly bright, this filter would darken the sky and allow you to have an exposure that was tone values that were more compressed. So you could capture the full dynamic range of the scene in one shot. And that was important with film, especially slide film, because you might have only had 7 or 8 stops of dynamic range, depending on what kind of film you were using. So these graduated neutral density filters were super useful. The challenge with them, however, was always getting them aligned just right, and if any object in the foreground, like a tree or something, or a mountain, protruded into your bright sky, well, they would get darkened too. Now, digital cameras, especially today's digital cameras, have amazing dynamic range. My Nikon D850 has about 14 stops of dynamic range, so that's almost double what I was getting from slide film way back in the late 90s. And if you expose properly for your scene, most of the time, and if you capture in RAW, you'll be able to recover highlights and really bring up shadows in post-processing. So you can capture that dynamic range without using one of these filters and introducing weird, imbalanced darkening. The other thing you can do, of course, with digital is shoot HDR capture. And so if you have HDR software or use Lightroom Classic, you can blend a bracketed sequence of exposures to capture that dynamic range. And while that has pros and cons, it's still a technique that we can use with digital that we didn't have with film. So as much as I love my ND grads, I just don't put them in the bag anymore. I don't take them with me. I find them to create more problems than they solve, especially because I can't use my lens hood with this, and they can create, again, reflections or dirt on the filter. Well, I showed you graduated NDs. Let me talk about another filter, and that's the solid neutral density filter. Now these are completely opaque, or they're not opaque, but these are completely solid. They don't have any kind of gradient to them, and they come in ring mount and in square rectangle mounts as well. Now these filters are specific for one job, and that's to cut back the amount of light coming into your camera. Why would you want to do that? Well, I can give you two good examples. The best example, and the reason why I carry these, and I carry a 6-stop, a 10-stop, and this one's a Stingray 15-stop, is to really darken the scene and force my camera to use very long shutter speeds, very slow shutter speeds. So this is with the tripod. And when you do that, you get these wonderful long exposures. That's how you can blur water, you can make clouds streak across the sky. It's a really wonderful effect. You need a tripod to do it, but it's fabulous. And so you want a good set of these filters if you're into long exposure photography. The other reason you may choose to use a solid ND filter is if you're shooting video. And in video, we have a different situation. You can't do a lot of post-processing on video. So if you wanted to capture video at its optimal frame rate of 30 frames a second, let's say, you want to set your camera to 30th of a second for shutter speed. A ND filter is going to help reduce that light in bright conditions and allow you to use that slower shutter speed. So these have a specific purpose, and they're absolutely useful for digital photography if you want to do long exposures. The last kind of filter I'll just briefly mention are special effects filters like starburst filters, prism filters, those kinds of things. They can be fun, and they can create effects that would be harder to replicate. In most cases, diffusers, soft focus filters, you can do a lot of that in post-processing now, especially if you use tools like Color Effects Pro. There's times when you might want to use a soft focus filter or a diffuser to get that look in camera. I don't use them a lot, but they can be useful at certain times where you want to create the look on the initial capture, because it's hard to replicate that effect in post-processing. So to run it down, if you're shooting digital photography, which I imagine you are if you're following me here on YouTube, protective filters, ask yourself what you're protecting your lens from before you put one on. Polarizing filters, great for removing glare, can be a real problem if you are using them to increase contrast in a sky. You're better off doing it in post. Avoid color correcting and enhancing filters because you can do it in your post-processing software. Solid ND filters, awesome filters for getting long exposures. Highly recommended if you're into that kind of creative photography. Graduated neutral density filters. There's a lot of ways to process high dynamic range scenes now that don't require a filter. So unless you're doing video or something and you need to hold back a sky, these you can pretty much leave at home these days. So that's my bit on filters. Let me give you the take-home message. So you should only use a filter when you can articulate to yourself the photographic reason for using that filter. Like, if you know that you want to remove glare from a stream, well then of course you're going to go and you're going to grab your polarizing filter, put it on your lens. If you're not sure why you're using that filter, well, just remember, it potentially degrades your image. So if you're going to use filters, always get good quality ones. Sure, they cost a little bit more. I mean, my Stingray filters cost a fair bit of money, but frankly, these are good. They are distortion free. They don't produce color casts, and I'm going to get a good quality image out of them. Cheap filters are just that. They're just cheap, and I would avoid using them. So until next time, thanks for paying attention. Thanks for listening. I'm Jason Odell. You can find me at luminescentphoto.com. Check out my YouTube feed, and you can find me on Instagram at Jason_Odell_photo. So I will hopefully see you soon, and until next time, happy shooting.